Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. My name is Matthew Brown. I'm the director of the Center for Values in Medicine, Science, and Technology. This is the first lecture of the year in our series on the power of creativity and imagination. Imagination, creativity have a really significant power in our lives. They're important for innovation, for science, in the humanities, in the creative arts. As our speaker tonight will tell us, it's also important for ethics. It's a special pleasure to be bringing the series of speakers to you tonight that we, this semester that we have. A great variety of perspectives. The very first year I was here, when the center began this iteration of its life, we had lectures on creativity. So this is a kind of return to the beginning for me, in a way. But I think adding the imagination explicitly to our discussions, going into areas of morality, of evolution, of poetry, of play, of childhood development are going to add a real level of sophistication to our discussions, and hopefully be of great interest to you. Our speaker tonight is Mark Johnson. Mark Johnson is the Knight Professor of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Oregon. He's a difficult person to introduce. In a way, he's nearly a household name with his book, Metaphors We Live By, co-authored with George Lakoff. Introduced metaphor theory, cognitive metaphor theory to the world and still has significant staying power. Professor Johnson has written a number of important books. Philosophy in the Flesh, also co-authored with George Lakoff. The Body and the Mind, The Meaning of the Body, the book Moral Imagination, and this book here, Morality for Humans. Ethical Understanding from the Perspective of Cognitive Science, a wonderful book that I recommend to all of you. Professor Johnson has done important work on the embodied mind, on what science teaches us about ethics, on the work of the philosopher John Dewey, who's close to my heart, and a number of other areas. He represents a real spirit of pluralism in philosophy, crossing lines from contemporary ethical theory to the pragmatists, to work on embodiment in the body. He trained with Paul Ricoeur as a graduate student, as well as Ted Cohen, the ordinary language philosopher. And he also has made significant impacts in and creatively synthesizes work in the cognitive sciences. And it's a real pleasure to have him here. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome up Mark Johnson.
Okay, can you hear me in the back? Is it okay? All right, it's a real pleasure to be here. I am especially pleased to see that there's a whole set of lectures devoted to imagination in all its different dimensions. I took a course from Paul Ricoeur when I was a grad student on Kant's theory of imagination, and Ricoeur said, this is a kind of overstatement, but he said, what philosophy most needs is to understand the imagination. And I've sometimes thought that idea has stayed with me all these 40 years, and in different dimensions of that. And let me just say, as Matt said, I have done all this work over the years. I started out with work on metaphor and conceptual metaphor. That morphed into a lot of emphasis on embodiment. So as you'll see today, one of my main concerns is that all meaning, thought, value emerges from an organism in an environment, and values come up out of that. And so the central role of the body in the constitution of everything, really, that matters to us. And so when I began, and I brought cognitive science to bear on that, too, in dialogue with philosophy and other disciplines. So as I said, at a certain point in my career, I said, you know, if you really take embodiment seriously and the central role of imagination, this has to have profound implications for morality, and in fact it does. And so I've spent over a 20-year period, starting in '93 when I published a book called Moral Imagination, up until this book, Morality for Humans. I spent those 20 years, I'm doing all sorts of work on embodiment, but particularly trying to think through what it means for morality. And so I'll talk about that tonight. And I just want to start with the following thing. What I'm about to say, I'm going to articulate a notion of moral imagination. And it is a radical way to think about morality. You may not think so, but I'll tell you why that's the case. And it's so radical that I suspect that many people in here will not feel comfortable with it, but let's see how that plays out. And I was just thinking one more thing, and they didn't tell me to do this, but as a pitch for the next lecture, Stephen Asma's coming, and 30, 40 years ago, he was a student of mine. And he's terrific. And I reviewed his book for the press, this new book that's come out on improvisation. So even if you think I suck, come out whenever next week or whenever Steve Asma's here. He doesn't suck. He's good. Okay. So I'll tell you, many people, philosophers, ethicists, regard moral imagination as an oxymoron, a kind of violent yoking together of disparate ideas. And they do this because they tend to think of morality as a system of usually rational principles or rules, and they regard imagination as a free play of images. It's unconstrained by reason. So to say moral imagination is to put two incompatible things together. And this isn't just ordinary folks who think this way. I'll show you in a minute how many philosophers who have talked about moral imagination still can't give imagination a full place in their thinking. So the mistake, as I say, is a bifurcation between reason and imagination, in which, you know, imagination is not allowed a constitutive role in our moral thinking. What they say is it's good for applying principles and such, but it's not really where morality comes from. And I want to say that assumption is profoundly false, and we need to rethink that. So where does the prejudice against moral imagination come from? Well, this is just one source of the prejudice, but it's fairly characteristic. It's a view I've named the moral law folk theory. And basically, you know this story. What do you learn? Human beings are, I asked my undergraduates, you know, in philosophy classes, all right, what does this philosopher say distinguishes us from other animals? Answer, rationality. You know, and then, so you get this idea that there's your embodied character, there's your rational nature, and that moral principles have to come not from your embodiment, your particular embodiment, not from your emotions, but rather they have to come from some source of norms, and that source is rational in some way. So on this view, if morality can really apply to our lives, the moral principles you have, thou shalt not, thou shalt, etc., have to apply literally, the concepts in them have to apply to concrete situations. There can't be any metaphor. Now, I spent my whole academic life writing on the central role of metaphor, so you know I'm not going to be happy with that. I think metaphor is pervasive in human moral deliberation. And there are two versions of this, crudely, that you'll all be familiar, or most of you will be familiar with. The first is that the source of the moral laws, these are absolute commandments issued by a deity or deities, okay? So I call that the theological version of the moral law theory. The second version is the one that came in through, it was made most famous by Kant. And the way I would say this is that Kant de-theologized Judeo-Christian morality. Instead of saying that morality comes from God who issues the principles, he said morality comes from a universal human reason. But everything else is pretty much Judeo-Christian morality if you read through Kant and you look at his examples and his judgments about particular moral issues. It's quite striking. Okay, so if you have this view and a certain view of reason as separate from emotion, you know that dichotomy. And if you think of imagination as not a rational faculty, but a kind of creative, faculty that can generate new things, but not necessarily in a rational pattern, then you won't think imagination has any significant role. Now, I'll just give you a concrete example from Kant, who's very explicit about this. So he says moral imperatives come only from practical reason. He says, thus the moral law has no other cognitive faculty to mediate its application to objects of nature than the understanding, not the imagination. Okay, he'd say that in German. Okay, in his lectures on ethics, I like this one, he warns against subordinating the rational moral authority that's within all of us to the seductive power of imagination. So he says, if he surrenders authority over himself, his imagination has free play. He cannot discipline himself, but his imagination carries him away by the laws of association. He yields willingly to his senses, and unable to curb them, he becomes their toy. Oh my God, the worst thing, to become the toy of your senses. Kant's going, nothing could be worse than that. Okay. Now, I want to trace a slow movement toward an appreciation of moral imagination. But unfortunately, what happens is that the only two people who really go into this are David Hume, for time's sake I'm cutting Hume out now, and Adam Smith, the theory of the moral sentiments. I talk about Hume if people are interested, but I'm very interested in Hume's moral philosophy. But what they represent is a kind of blip. They take imagination seriously in a certain way, and then you'll see what happens after that. So this is a rather interesting treatment that is particularly savvy in terms of contemporary cognitive neuroscience, as I'll suggest later. So here's what Smith says. As we have no immediate experience of what other men feel, we can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected, but by conceiving what we ourselves should feel in the like situation. So he's talking about projecting yourself imaginatively into the situation of the other. That's empathy. By the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation, her situation. We conceive ourselves enduring all the same torments. We enter, as it were, into her body and become in some measure the same person with her. So it's a kind of empathic projection, he realized. Now, this empathic capacity, quote, is the source of fellow feeling, a word that Hume and Smith make much of, for the misery of others. And they think that that's the basis of morality, that the foundation of morality is the ability to empathize with others and to have a fellow feeling, which means a kind of sympathy and empathy and a concern for their well-being. And he and Hume both believed that all humans who weren't sociopaths had a kind of spring in them of fellow feeling. And without that, we'd all be just a bunch of selfish bastards or whatever, running around doing what we will. It is by changing places in fancy with the sufferer that we come either to conceive or to be affected by what he feels. So Smith argues that the goal of our moral self-cultivation, and I'm going to approve of this. I'm going to say it's not enough. But the goal should therefore be to nurture our sympathetic feelings and to expand our capacity for an imaginative grasp of other people's experience. So this guy gave a central role to imagination. Now, I put this in because I'm later going to talk about the mirror neuron system. And this is a guy who never heard of a mirror neuron, but this is what he's talking about here. And you'll all recognize this. He says that there may be some correspondence of sentiments between the spectator and the person principally concerned. The spectator must first of all endeavor to put himself in the situation of the other and to bring home to himself every little circumstance of distress which can possibly occur to the sufferer. Okay? So then he says that, like, if I see a blow fall upon the leg of another person, I almost recoil in pain. I'll give you an example of this. Up until 5 years ago, I was still playing basketball. Now I finally had to quit. But one day we were out on the courts and there's this 19-year-old kid going down the court to make a layup, run a breakaway layup. Nobody's guarding him. He leaps high into the air and when he comes down, his leg snaps. And we all go, ah, you know, blood spurting out on the gym floor and compound fracture. Now, when I told you that story, most of you went, ah, you know. And, you know, that's what Smith's talking about, that we can feel the other in that way if we're not sociopaths. So more on this later. Now, what I'm going to do now is, you know, if I wanted to bore you to tears, I would go through this in detail. But a number of people over the in the 20th century, basically, have used the term moral imagination. So it's beginning to get used more and more. But I'll tell you in sum what I'm going to say. I'm going to quickly run through these and just give you a thumbnail sketch of some things they say so you can see how they're thinking about this. But you'll see that none of them really makes moral imagination the central thing. Okay? So if you're interested in this area, I could send you the references. I've spared you that. But here are some examples. Richard Hare, R.M. Hare, in Freedom and Reason. He says, says there's a fundamental rational principle of morality. He calls it the universalizability principle. It's kind of like Kant. But he says we need to know how to apply that. And in order to know how to apply that, we need imagination to kind of figure out what the other person is facing, what their experience is. Okay, but that's about all he says. No rich account of imagination. Now, getting better, Oliver Williams in the book The Moral Imagination says, this is so typical of how they do this. While moral images and the stories they compose shape reason to see rightly, they do not replace reason. You see, it's good to have moral imagination, but it can't stand in for reason. The stories and images, he's a Christian, the stories and images of the Christian community help one to discover God's will. But in principle, human insight and reasoning can discover this same will in the form of moral obligation. Okay? So you don't really need moral imagination, even though his book's called Moral Imagination. Now, this is very good. Patricia Verheyen tried to apply this to business ethics very insightfully. But listen to what she says. Moral imagination enables one to assess one's situation, to evaluate present and new possibilities, that's all good, and to create decisions that are not parochially embedded in a restricted context or confined by a certain point of view. However, one should not confuse moral imagination with practical moral reasoning. Here's the fear. Imagination alone can create fantasies that, too, become dominating and falsifying narratives. So it's not that far from Kant. Don't let your senses and imagination, you become their toy, and then they do with you what you will. even though she's very good and has a lot of insight about business ethics. It's just that the overall theory doesn't give as much of a place to imagination, again, even though that's the title, as I would argue for. Now, John Keeks, however he says his name, wrote this really nice book that I was excited about as I was reviewing it, Moral Imagination and the Enlargement of Life. And it's so good because at first he goes through 3 kinds of moral imagination. I won't go into the details there. And that's all very good. I won't go into them because most of what I'm going to say later, it's in there in germ in a certain way. But after doing all that great work on how we need the ability to project ourselves into the lives of others. We need the ability to imagine how situations will play out. That's imagination. He then says, the idea that living a good life is like creating a work of art, and that's what I'm arguing tonight, actually, that moral deliberation is an art. The idea that living a good life is like creating a work of art, that moral imagination is a species of creative imagination in which the artists work in the medium of their own lives, is pernicious because it leads to the rejection of moral limits. Damn, they can't get over this. We want morality to be constraining and universal and tell us what to do. And he's saying, Mike, you let imagination in and narratives that are powerful. And I think a good count of morality has to see that we're narrative creatures and look at the narrative structures in which our lives are embedded. But he can't abide it. After all this great stuff, he pulls back and he wants to say it can lead to the rejection of moral limits. It's just like Kant again, being carried away. Okay, really quickly. It starts to look better when with Hilary Putnam and Richard Rorty. But in fact, what you'll see, if you read Putnam, he has this fairly famous article in which he says that our lives are ordered by moral images. And he gives you an example of a moral image as fraternity or something like that, brotherhood. And that's it. That's all he says, no more. Okay, he's concerned with other things. But now Rorty, many people like Richard Rorty's stuff because Rorty says you need that what we ought to be about is the minimization of cruelty to others. And in order to do that, you need to understand their suffering. And what is the best way to understand the suffering of others? It's through narrative. That's Rorty, basically. But again, that's what he says. He has no account anywhere of how that's supposed to work, as far as I can tell. So here's what I'm saying. All of these people who have written on moral imagination, and there may be others I've missed, I grant that, but I've pulled this from different sources. They all say, yeah, moral imagination is okay, but it's not doing the main job. The main job's done by some normative source, whether it be reason or God or whatever. And imagination is kind of useful, but you got to be careful because it'll carry you away. Now, my hero, John Dewey, comes in, and he's going to say, moral imagination is constitutive of moral deliberation. It's not an aid to it. It is what good moral deliberation is. And so for the next few minutes, I'm going to try to articulate that view and make it plausible. So Dewey is going to say the following. He's going to say, good moral deliberation is imagining how a situation you're in would play out under different values. That's what moral imagination is. So keep that in mind, and then we'll see how this builds up. Now, in order to understand where we're coming from, and this takes me back to my work on embodiment, and this is the fundamental assumption upon which everything I do rests. It's a Deweyan idea, that everything begins with what? An organism in an environment in ongoing interaction. And my claim following Dewey is that all perception, all meaning, all value, all thought, all language, all symbolic import emerges out of organism-environment interactions. It doesn't drop down. None of that drops down from above, from some transcendent source of rationality or whatever. We're embodied, fundamentally embodied creatures in interaction with environments. So if we want to find our moral values, we better look for them there. Now, so it's an organism in an environment, and the environments are physical, they're interpersonal, and they're cultural. Now, here's Dewey's basic idea, if you don't know it. He points out that virtually most of what we do is habitual. We develop habits of interacting with our environment, and they become unconscious for us, and they drive us. So most of the time we're on autopilot. And Dewey calls this the intuitive dimension. And that's to say, you have built up all of these values you have, mostly without thinking about them. You've acquired them, and you've acquired habits of interacting in different situations that constitute yourself and your values. Now, Dewey says, okay, so what is a moral problem? When does a moral problem arise? And his answer is, a moral problem arises when your habits get into conflict. Now, I just want to point out that Dewey, some of you may know that one of the big movements in psychology is new work in moral psychology. And in a nutshell, Dewey saw this, 90 years before any of these people were working. But basically, I wanted to give you one example of this, because I think it's very important. This is Mark Hauser's example, but you can get this from many other moral psychologists. And basically, the idea is this, that we have two tracks of processing. We have an intuitive, fast, automatic, unreflective response system. Call that the intuitive. And that drives almost everything we do. We like to think that we're consciously, rationally in control, but for the most part, we're not. Okay? So call that your intuitive, which is what name they've given it. Now, we do have rational capacities, but what they say is that then, and the rational reflection is slow, conscious, maybe rule-governed, I don't buy that, but anyway, and after the fact. So this is rather nice. Jonathan Haidt, in The Righteous Mind, which is a really interesting book, Haidt has the analogy of an elephant and a rider. You know this? So your intuitive self is the elephant. And here's this little rider up there. And it's basically the elephant goes wherever the hell it wants to go. It's, that's the intuitive self and its habits that are driven towards certain obsessions and things it does. And then the rider is up on top, and that's your rational track. And it's saying, oh yeah, so the elephant ran over the garden. The rider's up there saying, well, I wanted the elephant to go over the garden. But they call that after-the-fact justification, okay? It's sort of like you make up stories. And I wish I had more time, because the research they've done on this, the examples they give to show this are pretty striking, and they're humorous. But what they show is that most of the time we don't do things thinkingly. We're just driven by the elephant. And then after the fact, if someone presses us, we sort of make up a kind of story that might make sense. And oftentimes they don't even make sense. That's what the research shows. Okay. So, what I'm saying, this is an addition I made, I'm saying that if you understand Dewey's view, you'd say there's an intuitive track, a kind of rational, after-the-fact justification track, but there's a third track, and that's moral imagination. So, what is that? So, what's the deal? He says organisms fall in and out of harmony with their surroundings. So, you go through, in other words, you go through life on autopilot. until what? I remember my dissertation advisor, Ted Cohn, was I don't know how many pack a day smoker back in the day. And he would go on lighting one cigarette off another one, you know, like this. And everything's fine. He's lecturing on Austin's speech act theory and, you know, things like that. And then all of a sudden, he reaches for his cigarettes, and guess what? He squeezes the pack and it's empty. And then what does he do? He goes, you know. In other words, what's happened? His habits of ordinary interaction that were fluid and automatic and intuitive are disrupted. And then he's got a problem. And Dewey, here's what's so cool. Dewey says that is the fundamental structure of all organism-environment interaction. You go on until what? Your habits are blocked by new conditions which don't satisfy them, that the habits don't satisfy. Then you've got a problem. And only then do you stop and think. That reminds me of a cartoon I saw. It was in a massage therapist's office, and it had these two people standing in front of a huge highway sign that says, "Stop and think." And one of them turns to the other and says, "Kind of makes you stop and think, doesn't it?" And Dewey's saying, what makes you stop? In other words, he's saying most of your life you don't think. You stop and think when you've got a problem. And then some people's response is this, no, I already know what the values are. I can just go back into it. And Dewey's saying, that's not intelligent. That's not intelligent inquiry. What you've got to do is figure out what the situation is you're in and then decide how best to move forward. And when you're doing that, you're creating new habits instead of simply reinforcing old habits. So it's a picture, and I'll tell you, if I had more time, I'm a big fan of Antonio Damasio's work. And Damasio says that the fundamental organism value is homeostasis. In other words, in order for an organism to survive, it has to create a boundary, its body, and it has to maintain a permeable boundary where nutrients come in and waste goes out. And within that boundary, it has to maintain homeostasis, or it will die. And he's actually tried to look at all moral values as cases of homeostasis. That's another issue. But Dewey was onto that you fall in and out, and that it's really a problem solver. So here's what I'm saying. Dewey's a naturalist. He's a non-dualist. He doesn't have spirit or soul or even mind as disembodied realities. So everything we do has to come out of our organic, natural being in the world. So here's what's cool. This need, search, satisfaction structure. Need is the felt, it's when the habits are disrupted. Search is looking for a way to resolve the tension. Satisfaction is reaching a resolution of the situation. And he says that's our organic model, and it holds for morality too. It holds for all inquiry, he thinks. So it's an embodied view of mind, meaning, and value. So our routine habits get blocked by newly arising conditions. We start to reflect, and notice this. The first stage of reflection is identifying the problem. The world does not come to it with, I'm a moral problem, tattooed on its forearm. In other words, how you determine what the problem is a form of inquiry already. Because what you decide the problem is will determine what possible solutions you can imagine. You see that? That's a big, important point. So then what do? We search in imagination. We try to imagine how a situation would play out under different values. So, in an earlier book, I gave an example of a 15-year-old girl. My son and daughter were both adopted, and they both had 15-year-old mothers. That made me think about that, birth mothers. And so a 15-year-old girl finds out she's pregnant. And what does she need to do? Well, Dewey would say it's not that she needs to consult absolute rational principles or or perform a utilitarian calculation of the greatest good for the greatest number. What she needs is what she least has as a 15-year-old. She needs the imagination and the life experience to understand how situations would play out. What if she keeps the baby? What will that mean for the family? What will that mean for her education? What will that mean for any relationship? What does it mean for the baby's well-being, etc. And I'm using that as an example of, one needs to interrogate their experience to see what's possible there. And that's the role of, that's one of the two roles of imagination. Okay, now this is a long quote, but it's famous, and it's a capsule summary of Dewey, so bear with me through this. The basic idea is that moral imagination is a dramatic rehearsal of possibilities. Dewey thinks experience has a dramatic character, and what you're doing is imaginatively rehearsing how situations would play out under different values. Here's how he famously said it. Deliberation is a dramatic rehearsal in imagination of various competing possible lines of action. It starts from the blocking of efficient overt action due to that conflict of prior habit and newly released impulse. Then each habit, each impulse that's working in you and in the situation, in the temporary suspense of overt action, it takes its turn in being tried out in imagination. Deliberation is an experiment in finding out what the various lines of possible action are really like. That's what moral imagination is in its deepest sense, I believe. So, it has two parts to it, I'm arguing. One, you have to empathetically imagine how others may be feeling and experiencing a situation. Two, there's another form. That's the ability to imagine narratively how your situation would develop. What are the possibilities open to you in your situation relative to certain values that are in play? And so it's like composing a situation. That's the sense in which it's art. It's a composition and an enactment of the meaning possibilities in your situation and trying to resolve them in some way that can reduce the conflict that you can encounter. So Franz de Waal defines empathy as the capacity to be affected by and share the emotional state of another, assess the reasons for the other's state, and identify with the other, adapting his or her perspective. So that's empathic imagination. I'm going to skip for time, but Adam Smith has that example. A mob, notice, when they are gazing at a dancer on a slack rope, naturally writhe and twist and balance their own bodies. This is the mirror neuron system. So, if I see you grasp a bottle to drink, there's areas of my motor cortex and premotor cortex that are activated as if I were grasping the bottle with that same grip and raising it to drink. And so this is a very important idea because it says that you can really be in and with others. What we do is simulate the experience of others. So that's what I've just described. Now, this action simulation, I want to talk about this just briefly, because I've gotten interested from the point of view of language and how meaning evolves. And I think I'm influenced by Lawrence Barcelow and Ben Bergen, who have talked about simulation semantics. And basically, what Barcelow says is that understanding a concept is simulating in your brain body the actions, emotions, affects, perceptions that are associated with that kind of object or event. So you're actually running a kind of neurally enacted simulation in you. He says problem solving, this is Larry, problem solving and decision making are processes of specializing a simulated plan in different ways to see which specialization produces the best outcome. Skill results from compiling simulations for most of the plans in a domain through extensive experience. So he's saying that the mirror neuron system and another, the canonical neuron system, lets us enter into the lives of others, in a sense, simulate experiences and how they will play out under certain conditions. Ben Bergen is a psychologist at UCSD, and he's got a great book called Louder Than Words. And what's so cool about this is he cites maybe a couple of hundred experiments they've done, fMRI mostly, but other kinds. And it turns out, if you are reading a book, and you're reading, she reached for the door with trepidation and slowly turned the handle. Well, as you're reading and slowly turn the handle, parts of your brain that would be activated in turning a doorknob or a handle are activated. And they can show this in real time. And so as you're going, there's a kind of simulation being developed. And I regard that as a key to the very possibility of imagination. How did I lose him? Sorry. Get back here. Okay. So, I'm going to bring this to a close fairly quickly now. What I'm saying is that imaginative moral deliberation is more like composing a work of art than it's like applying a rule to a situation. And this applies both to rationalist, deontological theories of moral principles and rules. It applies also, but this is take another set of arguments to give, it applies to certain utilitarian views that involve a kind of calculation. So through our thinking and action, we're composing and are developing situation, and we're simultaneously composing our self-identity. So every moral decision you make remakes yourself. It's the product of yourself as presently formed, but since that self is always in process and new habits are being formed in the moral imagination, a new self is emerging. So I'm going to give you an actual example of this. Say, bring this down out of the abstraction. I'm going to give you my story. I'm going to graduate from college. The Vietnam War is raging. My draft number, my lottery number for the draft in 1970 was 37. That year they went up to 240 or 260. So I was going to get my ass drafted and go to Vietnam if I consented. Now, what am I going to do? So, here's the story. I was brought up in Kansas, back before Republicans, it was a bad word, sorry. In Kansas, when Republicans were middle of the road, you know, really great, wonderful, middle of the road people, and everyone was religious or claimed to be religious, and so I had a Lutheran upbringing. And my dad flew seaplanes in the Second World War. The Navy was his, you know, he didn't actually fight, so he didn't, you know, being in the Navy was his great joy. And I actually got into Naval ROTC my first year of college because I was, I had no money. My dad had no money to send me to school. I could fulfill my obligations to my country, and I could get the tuition help, you know, that the ROTC scholarship gave. So my dad was thrilled when I did that, until I got out of that program and filed my conscientious objector status. Anyway, so here's the situation I'm in. I have two massive moral perspectives that are part of my life. On the one hand, I felt that I owed a duty to my country. And at the same time, I was in Philosophy 101, we were reading Plato. We were reading the Crito, where Plato says, look, your country, your city-state supported you. You never ran away. You took advantage of what we had to offer. Now the war, now we want you to do something. Don't be running off. You owe it to the state, okay? And you know, and my dad would tell me sometimes horrible things have to be done in the name of democracy. On the other hand, I was a Lutheran and I went to catechism, and you know, I heard it said, you know, you have heard it said of old, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say unto you, you know, render not evil unto evil and love the other and all of that. And I'm thinking, how can you love someone and not render evil for evil and kill them? You know, so like, what am I supposed to do? Well, guess what? Sergeant York, anyone seen the movie Sergeant York? You have to be of a certain age to. And Sergeant York, you know, won the Medal of Honor in the First World War. Anyway, he was a Kentucky boy. And Gary Cooper starred as Sergeant York in this very well-known film. So Sergeant York had the same problems. But he was brought up in a very strict religious fundamentalist home. And thou shalt not kill was a big deal. But he also felt his obligation toward his country in the First World War. So in the movie, I thought this was convenient. Gary Cooper, that is Sergeant York, goes up onto the mountain to pray and meditate on what he should do. He's been in training and they send him home and they said, decide if you can do this or not, and if you can't, don't come back. So he's up on the mountain, and here's Gary Cooper, and he's got his Bible. And the wind blows the Bible open to a certain page, and he looks and he reads, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar, and unto God that which is God. And Gary Cooper, Sergeant York, realizes that he can go to war. But I said, what? How do you know what it means to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God? How did that solve the problem? If you see what I'm saying? You couldn't read that passage and conclude that's an argument for going to war. It just says, render unto Caesar what Caesar's. Well, does Caesar have a right to have you go do something if it violates some ultimate moral, you know? And so there I was. I'm stuck. What am I going to do? And I went to my pastor, and my pastor says, Mark, my son's in the Air Force, and sometimes the Viet Cong go into churches and we have to bomb the churches. Sometimes you have to do bad things in the world, but it's for a greater good. I said, thank you, Pastor Allen, and left. Now, here's my point. There's no right answer here that is discernible by a fundamental rule or a utilitarian calculation. This is very much like Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism and humanism when he talks about his student that comes to him in the Second World War and is trying to decide whether to go into the underground or stay home and take care of his mother, who has lost her other son in the war, and her husband's a collaborator, you know. And Sartre says, choose. You got to choose. You're not going to find it's not that if you could find the right rational moral principle, you'd know how to act in that case. I'm saying that example of my own life is characteristic of our real moral dilemmas. There are many competing values. And they're not to be resolved by an algorithm or principles. Principles are important because what are they? Dewey says they're summaries of the collective wisdom of a people relative to certain situations they've encountered. But new situations emerge. So the last thing you want is a principle that is set in stone that can't adapt to the new complexities that arise. And I can give you other examples of that aren't just about war. You might say, well, we've always had that question, so there's not a new complexity. But what about new medical technologies, you know, with respect to birth and, you know, procreation and all of that, and all the problems they create that we never anticipated before. So here's what I'm saying is, this is the part where you're going to say, oh my God, all this led up to that, and then we don't get it. There's no way out. Well, the only way out, I mean, what Dewey's saying is, what you need is the imaginative ability to see how this would play out, and then you have to decide. And he's saying, folks, that's all you ever had. And now, in order to make that argument, in another part of the book, I argue against moral absolutism, that it's cognitively completely unfounded. And so I try to reinforce that part, that we don't have, we have moral principles and values, but we do not have access to these absolutes in a kind of unmediated way. So we have to view our values as, you know, important to be weighed in, but the problem of your moral dilemma is that the values are in conflict. Okay. So I'll close this off now. Dewey observed, and this is one of my favorite little lines in his, we humans are not little gods. The idea of a little god, being a little god, is that, that we get in our conscience, we become little gods as sources of moral authority. We have only our finite, fallible, limited perspective. And so we have to use whatever intelligent resources we have available to try to address the profound tensions that constitute moral problems. The better, there is no best, the better solution is all we can hope for, and we're not going to know if it's better when we make it, because you always know there are unforeseen consequences. Things happen over which you've had no control. So you can't tell in advance. In other words, let me put it this way. This is the metaphysics. The moral universe is not done. It's not complete. It's not fixed. I'm claiming, Dewey's claiming. The moral universe, like our natural world, is in process. So there's no finality so long as you draw breath for you. Thus, Philip Kitcher argues that we should always seek to enlarge the expanding circle. He gets that from Peter Singer. The expanding circle. And so what are the values? This is what I want to end with. What are the values we should cultivate for ourselves, our students, and our family, and our loved ones? What kind of person should we strive to be? Having rejected the notion of a moral faculty, and I would be another argument. I don't believe people have something in them called conscience. I think that's an artificial construct. But, so the old idea of conscience was that everybody had that, I call this the Jiminy Cricket theory, but that still small voice within you. And if you could just consult it, it will tell you what you ought to do, if you can approach it in the right way. You can imagine how much the booze I got when I went to I was invited to a conference at Stanford on conscience. And this is what I talked about. We don't have a conscience, I said. We're going, what? Get him out of here. So, but Dewey has a replacement for conscience. You see, Dewey didn't believe that we have faculties like reason, understanding, feeling. I think he's right about that. The cognitive neuroscience bears that out. We don't have these distinct faculties. However, in place of conscience, he wants to put conscientiousness. And that's what I want to end with. Conscientiousness, I'm saying, is a cultivated capacity for engaging in the most sensitive, perceptive, self-critical, expansive, open and imaginative moral inquiry in all matters of moral import that you encounter. And so it's a kind of virtue ethics that we should cultivate in ourselves as best we can, that kind of openness and imaginative ability to engage others empathically, to imagine how situations can play out. And by golly, the more we know about the world, contrary to what some politicians say, the better chance we have of not simply butting up against, letting our old habits run the show. So Dewey's answers to what we should strive to be is this. These are in my words. A sensitive and intelligent person with some measure of flexibility and plasticity because new conditions arise, and who is practiced in empathic imagination and imaginative dramatic rehearsal. And I'll end by saying I went to a conference in Vancouver on narrative. It was just fabulous. And, why do we think narratives are so important for our moral understanding, because we are narrative creatures. We live our lives narratively, and in a narrative you get complexity and particularity, and you have the chance to explore how situations play out. And so that engagement with those arts is one of the ways in which we cultivate our moral imagination. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions, and I'm going to give Magda this microphone. So raise your hand.
Me? You want to know what happened? It's just, this is life. I go down for my draft physical. It's like Alice's restaurant. You know, we're all standing there in our skivvies for 3 hours. Go through all the tests. The last thing you go to is a doc who looks you over. And he says, do you have any bone or joint deformities? And I said, well, when I played basketball, I had got Osgood-Schlatters disease in my knee here. And he says, oh, okay. You show up. We'll be drafted. You'll get your notice and come. On April 12th of 1970, I get home, and there is a thing saying I've been given what's called a 1Y, not 4F, which was, you know, not suitable for service. 1Y was a new category they made. It was sort of like, if we don't need you now, but if we need some more bodies, we're going to come back and get you. And so, and my draft board, I'd filed a CO, and my draft board had never, in Kansas, had never dealt with a CO. That's what I was told. And so I don't know if they just did that in order to, but that's in that life. You know, I won't go through all this soul searching and all of this, and it turns out I didn't have to have any courage at all. You know, damn it. I mean, I just slipped through, and I'm the beneficiary of having played basketball in high school when the doctor said, don't do that, it's going to hurt your knee. And I said, no, I want to play basketball. And yeah, so I didn't go.
Professor Johnson, thank you so much for your lecture and your work. I really love your work. I wanted to ask you a question about your metaphor of moral imagination is like creating a work of art.
Yes.
And so I'm asking why you chose that metaphor, because you could have easily said moral imagination is like building better tools, or coming up with alternative artifacts and creations. You're sort of implying some sort of aesthetic dimension. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's a great question. And in fact, you know, Dewey says, he has a phrase that you'll like. He says, moral rules are tools, in fact. Moral rules are tools. And so Dewey took the technology side, and he used the Greek notion of techne as a kind of rational mode of transformation of a situation to meet the contingencies of life. And so you could have that, but here's why I picked art. Dewey's, I mean, all my training, I had a lot of training in aesthetics, and I teach aesthetics, and I was profoundly moved by Dewey's account of art as the enactment of the possibilities of meaning in a situation. And Dewey argued that art is not just a certain narrow area of making, but that all of our experience has aesthetic dimensions to it. And I believe, and so Dewey's idea is that works of art attract us and we imaginatively engage them because they open up possibilities for how to be in the world and how the world can be. And I'd have to go into the details of that. But, and so I think that's the model that it's, notice it takes a certain sensitivity to what's there, what's being afforded by a situation. It takes a certain kind of cultivated taste, so there's an educative part of this. So I thought it was a better model, a richer model than simply saying tool. But Dewey has such a broad notion of a techne or a technology that you could call it a kind of technology. But I like the art one, if only, like I say, to poke you in the eye. Some people who want to say art, you know, they don't, and you saw that in some of those quotes. It's like the aesthetic. Well, the aesthetic is subjective. That's the big, rap against that. And I want to say no. There are subjective dimensions, but aesthetics is about the human capacity for making and experiencing meaning. And that's what we're about in morality. And I was influenced by my dissertation advisor when I wrote I wrote on Kant's theory of imagination. And the idea was that there's a kind of, we used to say rationality, that's not the best word, in art, but it's not explicable by rules. There's a kind of rightness about certain artworks. It's not explicable merely by rules for the creation of beauty. And I thought, yeah, that morality's like that too. You don't have definitive rules. You have rules as tools, and you need that. You're trying to compose a situation in a way that enriches, liberates meaning, opens up new possibilities, and reduces tension. It's a pretty romantic notion about art. That's another debate.
Hi, thank you. It was a great talk. I have a question about the mirror neurons and the moral imagination and understanding. So you used the example of sort of some part of a fiction where somebody's reading about turning a doorknob. Well, does it go beyond only the anthropocentric? I mean, I'm reading a book about slime molds, and not that I'm becoming a slime mold as I'm reading it, but my way of understanding it is picturing the slime mold gather up and come out of the ground. Is it only about humans?
Okay, now, I have limited knowledge of the extent of the research. It started with monkeys, okay? What happened was they were looking at these what neurons were activated when they grasp a banana. And the monkey's sitting there hooked up, and the experimenter in Parma went over and picked up the banana, and those neurons started firing off when the monkey saw him pick up. It has to be a specific pick up the banana grip, okay? So we know it's in monkeys, but this is and then we ask, is it in humans? And at first everyone said, oh my God, this is the solution to all our, to empathy and everything, and got very excited. Now some people are saying, well, they overdid it, and it's not so clear. I believe there's strong evidence that they're in humans. Okay. Now, are they in any other species? I don't know. But when we engage other creatures, I don't know about slime molds, but, seeing creatures grasp things, move their bodies through space and all of that, I do think that activates, and I can imagine that it could be taken down to the level of sort of generic kind of movements and the responses. But I'll tell you something, a lot of the research shows that you only get mirror neuron response for very specific natural actions. If you take a pair of pliers and pick up the banana, no. It's got to be a hand that grasps the banana. So I don't really have I don't know how that would be. Well, I want to say more, but I mean, I'm interested in music too and how music moves us. I mean, and I want to say you indwell in the music, and that this is experience played out, and you actually feel that temporal syncopation and rhythm and development, in a bodily way. And I think there's some people working on what they call the mimetic hypothesis in music, and they're using mirror neuron stuff. Very interesting.
Hi. In reference to what you were saying about the basis of morality, you talked about expanding an imaginative grasp for other people's experiences.
Yes.
And I wonder
that's the empathic side of imagination.
So I wondered if you could comment on how future generations' moral imagination can be stimulated in relation to the Holocaust and Holocaust literature in particular.
Well, it would apply generally to how can they, with respect to any reality. I mean, one needs to engage either through, and notice the mirror neuron system works if you read something, an account of something, if you hear it read, if you close your eyes and imagine it happening, and I don't know how they got this, but they say it also happens when you dream. So anything that would enact those kinds of experiences of cruelty, suffering, solidarity, whatever, can activate that kind of possibility for empathic response. And I mean, that's why, so, I'll just say something stupid, but, Schindler's List, you have your students watch Schindler's List, and that's it's a powerful narrative enactment and it keeps us emotionally engaged with the realities of what has happened there. That's all I would be able to say about that.
I have a sort of narrative question for you.
Narrative?
A narrative
or narrow?
question. A narrative question about you yourself. And that is that you were a student of a course, and as you were giving your talk, there were an awful lot of things that you said that I could translate into the language of phenomenology.
Yeah, right.
And you
Hermeneutics
didn't. And you didn't at all, though.
I didn't do it.
And I wondered whether that was just because, I wondered how you ended up going down the path of Dewey to describe these things and not the path of
it's just like life.
hermeneutics.
So all of that is back there from Ricoeur. I mean, I worked with Ricoeur when he was writing Time and Narrative, and he was teaching all that in classes, and my interest in imagination, and he taught me hermeneutics, and I've always felt a kinship with that and Gadamer, but it's just my own personal history. It's another story, but when I was working on metaphor, George Lakoff said, we can't sit around in our armchairs and do this stuff. There's science. We've got to pay attention to the science of cognition, emotion, values, and all of that. And he just kept beating me over the head with that. And that led me in a certain direction. And then I had a colleague, Tom Alexander, and actually there was more to this talk. Thank God you didn't get that. But I was going to end with a long quote from Tom Alexander, who has a terrific book called The Human Eros. And it's got 3 chapters one of them's on moral imagination, one of them's on pragmatic imagination. And it's just that historical thing. He was a colleague of mine. I sat in on a Dewey seminar. I fell in love with Dewey. Lakoff's telling me we got to pay attention to the cognitive science, and it goes that way. But, like in my classes, I used to read a lot more Ricoeur on narrative and that sort of thing in my aesthetic classes. I still do. But it just kind of moved me in that direction. And I believe you could find aspects of this in phenomenology and in hermeneutics, very much so. So I used to say my 2 big heroes were Merleau-Ponty, because he had all this embodiment stuff, and Dewey. So that's the kind of my own personal history took me off in that direction.
A question from a rationalist, universalist. The system 1 and the elephant and everything is not rational. It's not consistent. It's not uniform amongst people. So how does the moral imagination help us whenever we're dealing with problems between cultures, between nations? Joshua Green presents an argument that this moral intuitionism or this system 1 thinking intuitions are not going to help us whenever
That's
we're
right.
talking between Confucianism.
That's right.
And
Joshua's
so how
right
does
about
moral
that. Yeah.
imagination help us whenever?
Okay, so it's true that intuition is not going to help you because that's just your settled, sedimented moral habits and values colliding. That's why you need something. So what I'm trying to say is, and this is what I worked out in a couple of chapters that I didn't talk about here, but it's called the rationality of dramatic rehearsal or something like that. It's this third notion of moral imagination has a dimension that, and here's the way Dewey puts it, it's not valuing as the intuitive. You just value what you value. And he calls it valuation is when a critical dimension comes in. And he still thinks that a critical dimension is possible, but you have to, it's the same way that you say you can criticize a work of art. It's not, you can make these judgments, but you can't always say it's because it's backed up by a concept I have or a rational principle. And I believe when you get cultural clashes like this, that's what we really need is the ability to reach out beyond our situation and try to imagine, you know, I mean, there's no recipe for this, but it's what we need to do, isn't it? We don't need to convince them that we've got the right rational principles and they need to fall in line. You know, we've got massive cultural conflict, and we're trying to find, is there anything we can agree about to go forward? I think that's the human, that's actually what we find ourselves in. But too often, we're going to let them know that this is what they need to do. And we don't have an overarching, you know, unified rational framework for doing that. I mean, I'm not buying the idea that there's a universal rationality capable of generating the specific kinds of evaluative, you know, judgments we need to make. And you might want to argue about that. Apparently you would.
Okay, one question from a comparatist. You open your talk, you know, with two theories of the moral principles. One theological, the other is rationalist. I don't know whether you know the other perspective, that is the Taoist, the naturalist.
The what?
Taoist, naturalist, moral philosophy. You know, the Taoist says, Lao Tzu says, heaven and earth are not kind. They treat human beings as straw dogs. In other words, his idea is that there is no such thing as morality. It is neither moral or immoral. It's simply amoral. Mm-hmm. And also, you know, your talk, Dewey is your hero. I have one question for you about Dewey. In comparative philosophy,
yes.
Whitehead has a famous saying: if you want to understand Confucius, you need to read Dewey. Yeah. If you want to understand Dewey, you need to read Confucius. Yeah, yeah. So I would like to ask you the question, to what extent is Dewey familiar with either Confucianism or Chinese philosophy?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, first off, let me say, so when I put up there the moral law theory, I was trying to capture certain kinds of views. But notice, I didn't talk about virtue theories at all. But Dewey's got a virtue theory. And Confucius has a virtue theory, too. And Dewey spent 2 years living in China, 1920-21, or 1920. He loved it so much, he didn't want to leave, and he wrote extensively. And so, I don't know how much Taoism he knew, but he knew Confucianism. I just don't know the answer to that. And so people, you know, the comparativist I know, who's that guy at Hawaii who, yeah, Roger Ames. I mean, you know, he's been trying to show for years how certain Confucian views of virtues are compatible with pragmatist moral theories. And I like that stuff a great deal. And this sort of developing the cultivation of perception, you know, and proper relation and all of that, I think there's a lot of that in Dewey. I don't know if, you know, he published, notice he was in China 2021. He published Human Nature and Conduct, the great book, in 22, right after he got back from China. That's all I know. I'm not much of a historian of all that. But so I think that is a tradition. I don't know the Taoist as well, but the Confucianist tradition has an important place for cultivating that kind of imagination, I believe.
Hi.
Yeah.
I'm an undergrad student and I'm minoring in psychology, and it's my understanding that certain disabilities such as autism and certain physical injuries to specific parts of the brain can impair the mirror neuron system.
Yes, that's right.
And like hamper one's ability to put themselves in another situation.
Right.
And I was wondering if in the moral imagination theory, if that translates to sort of a moral handicap, and if there's a way you could remedy that.
Okay, I'm going out on a limb here. You're quite right about that, and people have talked. There are multiple people who think that some kinds of autism are, you know, cases of some issues with mirror neuron system. You know, whether that's the whole story or not, I don't know. But I have to say, if you, I'll be ableist, I guess, about this, but if you are unable to make that empathic projection, you know, according to some, you know, notion of full projection, I want to say it damages or reduces your ability to act appropriately in the situation. You know? I don't see another way around that. I mean, if you can't, to the extent that you have trouble doing that, you know, and that doesn't make you a bad person. I mean, one has to understand that in context. So I went to a conference in the Netherlands on deaf blindness. And, you know, I mean, that was one of the most eye-opening things I've ever done because, I mean, projecting into the reality of deaf-blind experience and what does it mean for your ability, you know, your ability to have imagination and to enact imagination. So I do have to end up claiming if I've given a kind of exemplary notion of moral imagination, if there's some condition that limits the enactment of that, it's going to be viewed as some kind of disability. Yeah. Maybe I need to think about that otherwise. You know, I have one of my former students, she now runs the CogSci program in philosophy at a liberal arts college. She wrote her dissertation called The Myth of the Standard Body. And I said, boy, you are cheeky. You know, you're going to criticize your dissertation advisor in your dissertation. And she said, all you white guys, you've got the, you know, you talk about embodiment, but it's always this standard embodied, you know, full, what we think of as, you know, active embodiment. And she wrote these brilliant chapters on the, you know, philosophy of disability and such, where you're saying that you're other-abled, and she showed how we tend to project a normative embodiment. That's what this issue is. I'm projecting a certain normative embodied cognition and affect picture. She's right about that. And the question is, where do you have to back off on that? And I don't have a great principled answer to that. Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious how, in relation to moral imagination, you characterize guilt, if there's any connection at all.
Guilt?
Guilt. Is it a part of the process of informing that, or forming our moral imagination? Or what, does it have any role?
You know, I believe, it's interesting, Dewey's view is that, on this, that guilt could have a place, but it's probably not the best motivational structure, you know. But to the extent that one feels they've fallen short of some standard of moral correct behavior, you know, it's a spur to remedy, you know. I mean, but he tries to articulate that, as you might guess, without positing some, like, conscience that can experience the guilt. So he's going to naturalize that. That's a good question, and I'd have to think about that. Well, you know, is there an important role that it can play still? It's not a topic he talks about. I mean, because he thinks it tends to be part of a certain traditional conception of, you know, how we're motivated morally and all of that, that he's rejecting. So I'm kind of stumped on that one. That's not a good way to end, but okay. Thank you.